Hello, welcome back to Your Story Radio, where we step into stories not just to hear but to feel. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, leave a comment below. We'd love to know where you're hearing this from, and if anything in it touches you, don't hesitate to share. He knew it the moment it started. The sudden sharp pains that shot up to his ears like knives. Then his heart started racing. He wasn't sick, not physically. It was anxiety, something invisible, but weighing like a boulder on his chest. For months, a silent battle had been going on behind the scenes. No one saw it. No one knew. It wasn't just stress fatigue or pressure. It was something deeper, something unnameable. Something had changed in the heart of the man who was playing Jesus. At first, it was just a role, but the role gradually became a spiritual burden, heavier and heavier with each scene. The line between acting and being present blurred and then disappeared. Before each scene, the whole space seemed to fall silent. He sat there. No lines, no expressions, just silence and a heavy heart. Tears came without warning, not from sadness, but as if something sacred was stirring from deep within. The lines he had learned by heart now rang out as if they were new. Not from memory, but as if they were coming from somewhere else, from a divine presence. Behind the camera, he did not just struggle with fatigue. He prayed more, fasted more often, went to confession, forged himself in spiritual discipline. The role was no longer a job, it had become a way of life. He was not just portraying God, he was being drawn closer to him. But that very closeness breeds resistance. A spiritual war is brewing, lingering like a shadow. The struggle was not visible on camera, but it weighed heavily on the soul. Sometimes the entire set, usually bustling and noisy, would suddenly fall silent. Everyone sensed something strange, as if there was an unspoken conflict going on. Equipment kept malfunctioning. Actors fell ill. Plans changed at the last minute. Every time the crew touched on sacred scenes, like the Sermon on the Mount, the Last Supper, or the Passion, the atmosphere changed. It was as if an invisible force was trying to prevent something sacred from being expressed. The pressure came not only from the outside, but also from within. When the camera stopped, he did not prepare for the next scene as usual. He quietly withdrew into himself. It was no longer preparation but surrender. He began to understand that this was no longer a project. It was an invitation. And sacred invitations always come with a price. On special days, when the crew was filming the most important scenes of the journey of the Messiah, the air was as thick as fog. A silent reverence hung over the set. No one said it, but everyone felt it. At that moment, acting was no longer acting. It became an offering. He, the man playing Jesus, was not only wearing the ancient costume, but also wearing the meaning of each gesture. Tears welled up in his eyes. Not because of the script, but because of the spiritual weight of each scene. Every word, every movement was an echo of the sacred. It was no longer a reenactment of history, but a return to that sacredness once again. Despite his broken spirit, despite his chaotic mind, he continued. Something inside him knew. This was important, Not just for himself, not just for the crew, but for everyone who was searching for a sacred truth through each frame. It is that truth, that light, that makes the darkness struggle to resist. Even in rehearsals, there are moments that are beyond control. There is a scene where a slap is heard, no longer acted, but has a symbolic meaning. The scenes of pain and suffering, even though simulated, have a terrifyingly real spiritual weight. The man in the robe is no longer just playing Jesus. He is carrying part of his emotions, part of his pain, and part of his sacrifice. The audience, the crew, everyone present felt it. They were not just filming a TV show. They were touching something eternal. Holy Week, the climax of Christ's life, began to be filmed. And at the same time, a storm seemed to be brewing, both literally and figuratively. The reenactments of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the tension of Christ's last days on earth, it all came rushing in like a flood. No one was prepared for the severity. Fatigue piled up. Sleepless nights became the norm. And then, the spiritual burden began to manifest itself physically. But in the midst of it all, he stood firm. Not by his own strength, but by the one he represented. He did not seek attention. He did not want glory. He only silently prayed, "Give me the strength to go on today." He knew that an invisible force was resisting. But he also knew better. There was a greater force keeping him from collapsing. As the final days of filming approached, the whole set was filled with a heavy atmosphere, both of anticipation and exhaustion. The scenes of betrayal, trial, crucifixion, like darkness enveloping everyone's hearts. No one spoke, but everyone saw everything was converging on a single point, the cross. And then, in a scene of the crucifixion, nature seemed to join in. The sky turned grey. The clouds rolled in. A storm began to form as if the earth and sky were bowing to the pain being recreated. The actor hanging from the cross, not just an image, but a living symbol. No one in the crew spoke. No one dared to break the silence. And then, thunder exploded. Not a special effect, not a lighting effect, but it was real thunder, real lightning, striking right near the cross. Everyone stood still. In that moment, the boundary between the material and the sacred seemed to be torn apart. It was no longer just art. It was no longer just storytelling. It was a message from above. No one needed to say anything. They all knew. They had just witnessed something beyond human understanding. The actor stepped down from the cross, not in panic, but with a deeper awareness than ever before. During the shoot, he experienced all kinds of strange feelings, chaotic heartbeat, physical exhaustion, inexplicable silences. He went to the doctor. He tried everything. But finally, he accepted one truth. This was a sacred battle. Not superstition, not imagination. It was real, clear, unrelenting. But in that very pain, he found clarity. This battle was not a curse. It was a sign of confirmation. That what they were doing was meaningful. That this was more than art. This was a mission. And mission always involved sacrifice. He began to change the way he prepared for each scene, not just studying lines or rehearsing. It was prayer. It was silence. It was surrender. He went to Mass whenever he could. He fasted more often. He sought spiritual direction every week. He carried a rosary in his pocket. This was not a performance. It was a way of being and a way of surrendering. The storm outside would eventually pass. But the spiritual pressure was still there. But now, he understood it better. He was no longer an actor. He was an instrument, not chosen for convenience, but chosen for a purpose. And that purpose required endurance. As the film progressed, the crew changed. No one spoke up, but everyone felt it. They were not just making a movie. They were carrying a sacred responsibility. The world they were recreating, the world of Christ's suffering and sacrifice, was no longer just a backdrop. It began to become a mirror of their own journey. The actor felt this change deeply. Every difficult moment on set, now it was no longer an accident. It was part of the story. The more he acted out scenes like the Sermon on the Mount or the Last Supper, the more he felt personally connected to each word of God. This was no longer an external role. It was an internal reality. If you are listening to this, you probably sensed it too. This is not just a story of a movie. This is a journey of obedience, of transformation of an invisible battle in which we can all see ourselves. Leave a comment if you have ever experienced such a silent storm. And don't forget to subscribe to your story radio to continue going through stories that are both quiet and imbued with sacredness, the pain, the fear, the torrent of helplessness, all of it mirrored Jesus' own journey. Behind the scenes, the actor began to reflect more deeply on the price he was paying to participate in such a sacred project. Between takes, he didn't seek a quiet place to study his lines, but to pray, not to act better, but to avoid overshadowing the story he was telling, to step back, to let God's own light shine through him. He knew the challenge would be more intense, but at the same time, his desire to serve that story grew stronger. As the crew entered its most intense scenes, the Garden of Gethsemane, the trial before Pilate, and finally, the crucifixion, the pressure mounted. It wasn't just the hectic schedule. It wasn't just the endless hours in front of the camera. Something deeper was at work. A war, invisible to the naked eye. With each passing day, the atmosphere on set grew heavier. Emotions were building, expectation mixed with exhaustion. The actor felt it in every heartbeat, every breath. This was no longer just a battle for a role. It was a battle for his own soul. But the more he was attacked, the more he was opposed. The more he realized the truth, the more resistance, the more the mission proved to be valuable. And then, it was no longer just his business. They began to receive letters. Letters came from all over about lives changed by the program. There were marriages healed, addictions broken, souls returning to God. He read each line, not just with gratitude, but with deep humility. He knew this was not his work alone. This was a collective mission, a spiritual journey where everyone is playing a role. As the final scenes approached, something big began to happen to him. Each scene, each moment in the story was no longer just about the art, but also about the spirit. The experience of playing Jesus was no longer a role. It was a personal transformation. He felt himself being remade, not by acting techniques, but by the character he was representing. In one iconic scene, the crucifixion, all of that came to a head. Not just the physical weariness, not just the emotional turmoil, but a divine presence as if it were pervading the air. He stood before the cross, feeling history, divinity, and humanity converge in that moment. And he began to ask himself, who am I to represent him? Can anyone really convey the depth of this experience? The doubt was fleeting. Immediately, a sense of sacred responsibility rose above all else. He knew this had never been about him. It was about the message, about the truth that needed to be told. And for that, he gave it all. Body, mind, soul. There were days. The burden became almost unbearable. Days when he thought, I can't go on. But then, he remembered why he was here. Not for praise, not for fame, but to tell the story of the Savior, to show the world a small part of the pain of the death and of the resurrection. Every time he stepped on the set, he recommitted himself to that sacredness. And he was not alone. The entire crew, from the director to the supporting actors, could feel something was there. There was tension, yes, but there were also moments of deep connection. A collective silence, as if we were all serving something higher. No longer a film production, but a sacred service. If you are listening to this story tonight, leave a small prayer below, or just an Amen. We believe each of us is being called to participate in something beyond ourselves. Don't forget to subscribe to continue accompanying your story radio, because there are many sacred things waiting to be told. Your story radio would like to thank everyone who has been with us on this journey of discovering stories of faith art and deep transformation. Thank you for listening. And now, back to the story in progress. This is not just a film. This is a sacrifice, a collective act of faith, silent but powerful. It is not only those present on the set who will feel it. Millions of viewers around the world will one day witness the message of Christ, not through a sermon but through the light, the frame, and the breathing of a strangely alive character. And then during that filming, something unexpected happened to the lead actor. When he transformed into Jesus, he was not just acting. Something moved inside him. A mysterious, sacred, ever-deepening bond between his personal beliefs and the character he was portraying. The boundaries were blurring. The lines were no longer memorized scripts. The gestures were no longer just stage props. Every word, every look, every prayer carried a meaning that transcended art. He was no longer just an actor. He was becoming a vessel for the sacred to flow through him to others. But the transformation was not easy. There were days when he was physically exhausted, mentally weary, and tested in his faith. In the breaks between takes, he did not turn to the script. He turned to prayer. Because he knew he had to cling to his roots, to not lose sight of his original purpose, to continue walking on a path he believed was guided by an invisible but loving hand. He was not alone. The entire crew, from the director to the lighting technician, sensed something greater was at work around them. The atmosphere on set became different. It was no longer just a movie. Every step, every shot seemed to be set on sacred ground. But where there is light, there is also darkness. The deeper we delve into the story of Christ, the more obstacles there are. Production delays, personal events, invisible rifts, and even unnamed spiritual battles. The actor clearly felt it. There was an invisible pressure on his shoulders, like a weight that wanted to break the spirit of the entire project. But he did not back down. Instead of giving up, he prayed. Prayed for strength, prayed for clarity, and above all prayed to be a channel, so that the most sacred things could touch the hearts of viewers. This spiritual battle was not only within him but also spread throughout the entire crew. Many times they were perfectly prepared. The lighting was perfect, the sound was perfect. Then some invisible incident broke everything. It seemed like there was some force that did not want this story to be told. But they did not give up because they believed this was not an ordinary film. This was a mission. And each person, whether the main actor or the sound assistant, was a part of that great thing. The actor began to ask the question, can a human being with so many mistakes like me express something so sacred? The doubt was very real, but the calling inside him was also very real. He was not just playing a role, he was becoming a bridge between the audience and the sacred. More and more he realized this role was not about him. It was about the message he had to convey. And even when the camera stopped, the role continued in his own life. When he wasn't acting, he continued to pray. Not to practice, but to connect. So that the truth wouldn't be lost amid the layers of makeup and stage lighting. The responsibility wasn't just physical or emotional. It was a spiritual journey. He began to live differently, praying more, fasting, confessing, seeing a spiritual director. Step by step, he let his faith guide him, not to complete the role, but so that the true light could shine through each look, each line. And as filming continued, the invisible battles became more intense. Each scene was like a sacred summoning. No longer a job, no longer a performance, but an invitation for the truth to be heard. You are listening to Your Story Radio, where sacred stories are told from the heart. If you are feeling emotional, please share your thoughts in the comments. We read each of your words with sincere gratitude. Have you ever had an artistic experience that made you feel the presence of the sacred? We would love to hear your story. There are truths that resonate far beyond the screen, directly into the hearts of viewers. But the journey is not always easy. There are days when the role seems heavier than any prop on set. Doubts creep quietly into the mind, pressures that seem insurmountable. And it is in those moments that the actor understands. This role is not for praise, not for fame, nor for those who seek the limelight. This is a calling, a mission, and it requires sacrifice. In the quiet moments between takes, he often retreats to a quiet corner, not to review his lines, but to pray. To find the strength, not just to act, but to become the truest reflection of Jesus. This is no longer a role. This is a journey of life, a sincere dedication with every breath, every look. And the cost, physical, emotional and spiritual, was undeniable. He battled fatigue, moments of soul-crushing exhaustion, nameless pressures that weighed down in the darkness. Yet, in the midst of all this, he felt more clearly than ever. This was where he was meant to be. This was what he was called to do. The more he filmed, the more he understood that this was more than just recreating a historical figure. This was living God's story and sharing it with the world. As the crew moved toward the big scenes, the Sermon on the Mount, the Last Supper, the Passion, the setting itself changed. The feeling on set was no longer the simple thrill of acting. It was sacred. A heavy silence, because this was more than art. This was a window into a spiritual dimension, a truth of eternal proportions. And it is no surprise that spiritual resistance also begins to appear. Every time a crucial scene is filmed, strange things happen. People fall ill, cameras malfunction, internal conflicts. Spirits are exhausted, but instead of being a hindrance, these difficulties are a sign that something very real, very important is happening. There is no doubt about it. The story being told is not just for entertainment. It has the power to change lives, to move souls. And the devil does not stand still. In the midst of that storm, the actor does not retreat. He goes deeper into his faith. He prays more. He fasts. He seeks out spiritual guides to keep himself awake. He understands that now the important thing is no longer to play this role well, but to become an instrument, a vehicle for the word of God to be spoken, no matter the cost, the sweat, the sleepless nights, the inner turmoil. All are no longer obstacles. They are the path of a messenger, a person chosen to tell a story that has changed all of humanity. Every prayer, every line, every scene becomes an offering, a silent offering, a small light lit in a world that is too tired. The deeper he gets into the role, the more he realizes what he faces is not just a challenge in a movie. It is a reflection of a deeper spiritual war, an invisible battle between light and darkness. And there is an unchanging rule: the more light there is, the stronger the darkness struggles. Financial instability, health declines, production stagnates. With each important scene completed, a new set of difficulties comes. But instead of collapsing, he stands firmer, because he knew his role was not to play Jesus, but to bring the light of Jesus to humanity. There were truths being told here, truths that reached far beyond the boundaries of the screen and into the hearts of the viewers. But bringing those truths to life wasn't always easy. There were moments when the weight of the role became almost unbearable. Doubt crept in. The pressure felt relentless. And it was in those moments that the actor came to a quiet, piercing realization. This was never just a role. This was a calling. A message that demanded more than talent. It demanded surrender. It was never about fame, never about recognition, never even about personal achievement. It was about becoming a vessel, an instrument through which something holy, something eternal could shine through. In the silence between takes, the actor often disappeared, not to rehearse lines, not to prepare for the next scene, but to pray, to ask for strength, to open his heart so that Jesus, not the actor, would be seen. Because by this point, he knew this wasn't performance. This was worship, and the toll was real. There was the physical exhaustion, long hours, harsh conditions. There was emotional weariness stepping into grief, compassion, anger, love over and over again. But more than anything, there was spiritual resistance, a heaviness that couldn't be explained by fatigue alone. Yet, in the middle of those storms, the actor found clarity. He knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The more the production moved forward, the clearer it became. This was not just a historical drama. This was a sacred retelling, a mission cloaked in script and scene. As they approached the pivotal episodes, the Sermon on the Mount, the Last Supper, the crucifixion, the weight intensified. The team could feel it. Something unseen had shifted. This wasn't just storytelling anymore. It was spiritual territory, eternal ground, and with it came warfare. Every time they prepared to film a scene that carried eternal weight, resistance would rise. Illnesses, emotional breakdowns, technical issues, delays, personal crises. But rather than retreat, the actor pressed in deeper. These attacks, as painful as they were, became confirmation. Something powerful was happening here. Something worth opposing. And so he leaned harder into prayer. He fasted. He sought wisdom from spiritual mentors. He grounded himself not in his own strength, but in something far greater, because the role had changed him. He no longer saw himself as an actor. He saw himself as a vessel willing to be broken if it meant the light of Christ could shine through. Every scene became an offering. Every word a prayer. Every moment on set a chance to pour light into the dark. And as filming continued, the spiritual battles only deepened. They weren't just filming a show. They were stepping into the story of redemption and all the resistance that comes with it. Financial setbacks, production delays, unexpected illnesses, they all came like waves. But each time, the actor chose to fall to his knees instead of fall apart. And then came the crucifixion. Filming that moment wasn't just a climactic scene. It was sacred ground. It demanded more than grit, it demanded reverence. As the actor stood there, bruised, bloodied, bearing the weight of that cross, he realized the enormity of what he was representing. This wasn't just a reenactment. This was an echo of the greatest act of love in human history, and the clarity that followed was piercing. This role wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about giving everything he had emotionally, physically, spiritually, so that others could see Jesus more clearly. He prayed more. He surrendered more. He fasted not just for strength, but for purity of heart. The toll grew heavier. But so did the grace. The deeper he went into the story, the more he understood it wasn't about perfection. It was about surrender, allowing the Holy Spirit to do what no actor ever could. Letting Christ shine not through flawless performance, but through a heart fully yielded. And slowly, something began to shift inside him. He stopped seeing the role as something he played. He started living it. Every set became a sanctuary. Every scene a prayer. Every hardship a holy offering. Yes, there were moments of doubt. Yes, the weight nearly crushed him. But he pressed on, not for applause, but for impact. for healing, for the unseen miracles that were happening behind the scenes. And then they began to arrive. Letters, emails, testimonies. People writing in to say that the show had changed their lives, that marriages were being healed, that broken hearts were finding hope, that faith was being reborn. And as those stories poured in, the actors' understanding deepened. This role wasn't just sacred, it was necessary. With each passing day, the actor's sense of divine purpose became sharper. What once began as a role now felt like a calling. The uncertainty that shadowed him in the beginning slowly gave way to a deep inner conviction. The struggles he faced weren't obstacles. They were part of a larger sacred tapestry being woven beyond his understanding. Portraying Jesus wasn't about mastering a performance. It wasn't about perfect lines or cinematic brilliance. It was about becoming a vessel, one that allowed the truth to flow through without pretense, without polish. The actor came to understand that his role wasn't about acting anymore. It was about presence, surrender, and faith. It was about letting the light of Christ shine even in the brokenness of exhaustion or fear. Every hardship on set, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, became part of the narrative. The actor's personal trials began to mirror the very story he was telling. His journey, as unexpected as it was, merged with the message he was bringing to life. This wasn't just another show, and he was no longer just another actor. In the quiet between takes, when lights dimmed and silence fell, he would slip into solitude, not to prepare for his next scene, but to reconnect with the very God he was portraying. Those moments became altars, places where he laid down his fears, his weariness, and found strength not in himself, but in the one he represented. The work was grueling. Long hours, repetitive takes, demanding emotional depth. At times, he questioned his sanity, and yet there was something undeniably holy about it all. The set had transformed from a place of production to sacred ground. Every prop, every beam of light, every line rehearsed carried spiritual weight. It was more than drama. It was devotion. As the actor leaned further into the role, he discovered it was asking more of him than he ever expected. His comfort, his peace, his very self. But in return, it gave him something far greater, a closeness with Christ he had never known before. The role demanded pain, but gave purpose. It required loss, but offered understanding. Each scene became a sacrifice, each line a prayer. He wasn't just portraying Christ, he was walking with him, living out the echoes of a life that had once changed the world. And that's when the letters began pouring in. Stories from viewers' marriages, reconciled addictions, broken prayers, rekindled each testimony wrapped in raw emotion. They reached him like whispers of confirmation. The pain wasn't in vain. The exhaustion wasn't meaningless. God was moving, and somehow he was part of it. He had stepped into a job, but now he stood inside a mission. And missions, he realized, demand sacrifice. He wasn't simply an actor reciting words from a script. He was a participant in something eternal, a conduit, a thread in a divine story, still being written across generations. The attacks, emotional, spiritual, sometimes even physical, no longer felt like deterrents. They were shaping him, forming him, strengthening his resolve. As the filming progressed, the weight of the role intensified. The more he embodied Jesus, the more the line between character and self began to blur. he felt the heaviness of the mission in his bones. The spiritual pressure became tangible. Filming wasn't just tiring, it was a battlefield, a constant war between flesh and spirit. He found himself praying more often, not for success, but for strength. He turned to fasting, confession, and spiritual mentorship, not to stay in character, but to stay grounded in God. His days became a rhythm of reflection, action, exhaustion, and renewal. He stopped performing. He began living the role. Doubt came, of course. On certain days, it roared louder than faith. Was he worthy? Could he carry the image of such a sacred figure without staining it? But each time he was reminded, this wasn't about his worthiness. It was about God's grace. Near the end of filming, as they approached the most sacred and harrowing scenes, the Last Supper, Gethsemane, the crucifixion, the weight on his shoulders became almost unbearable. These weren't just scenes, they were sacred rituals reenacted. And each one took a piece of him. The suffering portrayed began to feel very real. His body ached. His heart was raw. His spirit stretched to its limit. But in that breaking, something holy emerged, a kind of surrender, deeper than he had ever known. Not surrender to the role or to the director, but to God. And so he gave everything, not to win applause, but to be faithful. When the final scene was shot and the last cut echoed across the set, he didn't feel relief. He didn't feel pride. He felt silence, a holy silence. The kind that follows a sacred act. The kind that wraps itself around a soul changed forever. He wasn't the same man who auditioned for the role months before. He had walked through fear, fire doubt, and grace. He had glimpsed the weight of the cross, not in wood and nails, but in responsibility and surrender. And that glimpse had left a permanent mark. It hadn't just been a role, it had been a pilgrimage. And as he walked away from the set for the final time, he didn't just carry memories. He carried a mission. To continue living, not as an actor who had once played Jesus, but as a man who had dared to try, and in the trying, had encountered him for real.